Fantastic. Well, my name is Michael Lasur, and I've been in tech for, gosh, about 20 years. The last 10 specifically has been sort of working with different security vendors, predominantly on the network solution side. And in the last couple of years, I've been with Vectra. And depending on how familiar you are with Vectra, probably the easiest way to think of what we do is we're sort of data science and threat intel all rolled into one. And the goal is really leveraging, AI to automate detections, but even more than just detections, but detections that are prioritized, if you will, in terms of your enterprise system. And essentially what we're looking for is advanced attacker behaviors. And we help address that prioritization based on really two concepts: threat and certainty. How risky is something to the business, and how certain is the AI or machine learning model in terms of validating that. Another way to kind of think about what we do is identifying specific behaviors that are extremely difficult for advanced attackers to avoid as they behaviorally move through the kill chain. So command and control, recon, lateral, and exfil. So again, thanks very much for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here for the next few minutes. What I want to really talk about is cover some fundamentals that make Office 365 such a rich target for attackers today. So if you think about what's been going on in terms of kind of this journey we've been on in terms of the last 4 or 5 years in terms of digital transformation, and then fast forward to 2020, COVID has really accelerated this rapid shift to work from home. And now, basically every home network is to some degree a component of, the corporate or the enterprise. Cloud's rapidly becoming a bigger part of, the network, no longer seen as, kind of an isolated, separate component. And then everybody's starting to really, get their head around concepts as, vast as, zero trust with, kind of the key elemental, pillars of, being able to protect the endpoint, having to harden, access across cloud and data center, and then, having the ability to, detect and basically monitor everything. And yet, attacks remain, really well hidden. And they're able to do that because they're leveraging blind spots that exist between, data center, your IoT infrastructure, network, and cloud. So living in a SaaS world, if you will, Office 365 has kind of dominated the productivity space with, I think now easily over 250 million users monthly in terms of active users. And then if you think about it, Teams, has recently hit over, I think, 115 million active daily users. And it's not slowing down. Office 365 is sort of the core of what I'd call enterprise data sharing, whether you're thinking of storage and communications, which just makes it an extremely rich data target for attackers. And so it's really no surprise that Office 365 has become a really big focus for attackers. And despite the adoption of multi-factor authentication, as well as some other strong security controls, the financial and reputational damage from Office 365 data breaches continues to kind of increase. And of those breaches, account takeover, or what's known as ATO, is probably the fastest and most prevalent. So much so that attackers are actually focusing on account takeover rather than email compromise to gain their initial access. And if you think about it, email compromise has always been sort of the top way in, for an attacker in the last, 4 or 5 plus years. Microsoft 365 users around the world for the first time generated more than 30 billion collaboration minutes in a single day, you know, recently, as people communicated, collaborated, and co-authored content across, work, life, learning. And this is a new metric that Microsoft is calling out. And it's kind of reflective of the changing nature of work in general. With Teams as sort of being, kind of a central hub, Microsoft 365 brings the power of the cloud pretty much to every person who wants it, giving them kind of an integrated experience in sort of this new world of work that's kind of forever changed in comparison to, pre-2020 work culture. So in terms of kind of the core message that I want to talk about and look at is this kind of huge shift in terms of how we kind of communicate and where we put our data today. It goes without saying that with this massive kind of adoption of Office 365 and this new kind of work from home environment, where we somehow figure to stay connected via the cloud, but don't actually connect directly to computers anymore. Quite simply, Office 365 has become kind of the number one attack surface. 2020 obviously helped kind of force this into reality. And honestly, I don't think that's going to change going forward. I don't think we'll really ever go back to being what it was like, pre-COVID. I do believe, today we live in a very different world than before 2020. And if we kind of stop to think about what's in Office 365 and why it's so valuable, just stop and kind of think about that. It's pretty much everything. It's not just email. It's mainly, if you think about it, at least the way I think about it, it's mainly kind of OneDrive and SharePoint. And the reason I say that is, it's essentially become the filing system for corporate America. Most companies use it religiously, and the majority of data, including, is included in that is things like, the company's intellectual property, patent secrets, customer data, trade secrets, even their crown jewels, essentially, sit in some form or facet on OneDrive or SharePoint. Most of us, if we have adopted, the same kind of outlook to ease and convenience that OneDrive provides personally, have all of our data there, or a lot of it, or in something very similar. And likewise, it's true with, most companies. When you look at Office 365, kind of at a high level, in terms of the suite of apps, they're all interconnected as part of this, environment. And that's important because this means anything of value for, either a public or private company that's reliant on Microsoft sits essentially within that Office 365 environment. And this is true for Vectra, as a company, and pretty much every company we talk to, about security or cloud security that utilizes Office 365. Attackers are smart. They're also pretty simple when it comes to it, and they follow the data. So using, they're going to use proven techniques. They're not going to go out of their way to do something unique if they've got a technique that's worked. They'll continue to use it. So how big really is the problem? Well, these numbers are actually from, last year, right before 2020, when it was kind of just getting started to become, kind of a real problem. 40% of companies have experienced some kind of Office 365, account takeover. So what basically constitutes an Office 365 account takeover? We're constantly hearing about things like phishing, which is really, that's a method of infection, right? How an adversary basically gets, onto some kind of device, or gets someone to basically click on something to either install some kind of code or seal a password or access some kind of content. Account takeover, a little bit different. It's the concept of basically stealing a person's user identity. and then being able to use that identity to basically impersonate them in order to access any of the resources associated, with that individual. Now, account takeover can occur within, any software as a service or application, with the idea being, if I can take over an account and essentially impersonate a user, I have the same freedom of access as that user within that service. And with the legitimate account, you can just imagine what's possible within Office 365. Because when I'm impersonating somebody, it's a legit user. So, obviously, this is a growing, problem in Office 365. So, in response to account takeover, typically what you're going to hear from the market in terms of how they respond is sort of this generic, use multi-factor, use two-factor authentication to address that issue. Now, although I agree that at a minimum, everyone should deploy multi-factor, it's a good call for what I call covering the basics. It's good hygiene, right? But it's just not enough. There's three ways people are still getting around multi-factor with Office 365. And at a high level, it's legacy protocols, malicious Azure apps that basically allow or facilitate, some kind of persistence, or some convenience in terms of things like stay signed in productivity features. So we're going to delve into these a little bit more, but multi-factor authentication is built, with current services in mind, but does not support all the legacy protocols. It often leaves these, oftentimes, Microsoft will leave certain protocols enabled, and it's your responsibility to determine whether you actually need those protocols enabled and turned on. And it's up to you basically to turn those off if you don't need them. So a couple ideas here of potential persistent token, and this concept of what the home network looks like, and we're going to talk a little bit about this example of this bypass attack. But if you think about persistence, and then you kind of partner this with what's happened in this last year, with all of us working from home, it's not quite the same as your best of breed security infrastructure and security stack that's sitting in your corporate enterprise environment by any means. Even the latest gadgets, and if you're anything like me, you probably are more than willing to spend a little money to kind of buy the latest gadget. But it's typically, when it comes to deployment, it's the 80-20 rule. Typically, I'm leveraging about 20% of the capability. Ultimately, what that means at home for me is I've got partial coverage at best. Nobody was really ready for work from home. I still get kind of dirty stares from my friends when I insist that they join my guest network, and it's a 15-character passphrase, right? People don't want to do that. Anyways, here's an example of some details we've seen related to a bypass attack. If I can start essentially with a compromised account, whether that's through some kind of poisoning versus traditional phishing, the idea is once I'm on the inside, there's perceived trust. So there's this idea that if I'm trusted, defenses for the most part can come down right away. Most people don't really have coverage for Office 365. And the idea here is, once in the cloud, there's very limited behavior before, someone can kind of fully, move to Office 365. So once in terms of this bypassing MFA, once they're in, again, there's very limited behavior before, being able to kind of fully traverse into something like Office 365. and basically drive towards an objective. And then it's rather hard to find an attacker once they've transitioned into the cloud. Security is one of the first thing that suffers. I mean, I think all of us probably saw that to some degree through all the dynamic kind of reshuffling, introduced by the pandemic. Fast transformation, is a prime example. We've got to get it done to keep the business moving, but security, can become an afterthought in that kind of dynamic situation. And that's why, on average, the cost of data breaches can keep increasing. So let's look a little bit about, so let's talk a little bit about some of the Office 365 attacker tactics. So what I want to do here is just kind of look at some basic concepts of, what attackers do. Now, these are what I call the obvious. And these are sort of also what I refer to is, the very simple and straightforward. So being able to use things like search, and that's across emails, Teams, and even can be done for files, for passwords or financial data, or the idea of being able to set up an email forwarding rule for ongoing visibility. So think about this from an attacker's perspective. If I can automate something that's constantly watching and looking for something of interest, and then once it's found it, forwarding that information to an account that I have, and then maybe even exfilling that to an external account or even a Dropbox, or things like fraud, via trusted communications. Again, because I'm perceived to be on the inside, there's not a challenge to this idea of trusted communications. Other things like watering hole attacks, so poisoning common files, or ransomware, being able to easily encrypt files, and then exfiltration, so high value email data, through mail forwarding. These are all very effective ways to take important information and basically exfil it at some point or find it easily. And these are not sophisticated functions. These are available, and most people can use these easily. So if I have an authorized account, it's very easy for me to kind of leverage some of these tools. So we talked a little bit about legacy protocols. Again, one of the things that can be used to circumvent multi-factor. Just a little bit more on that. Legacy protocols, in this example, is being used to basically, again, bypass multi-factor. Specific tools here, to basically, if somebody's still using MAPI in their environment, it can be used to, again, circumvent, because multi-factor doesn't cover some of those legacy protocols. Multi-factor was built with the concept of addressing current services, but does not support some of those legacy protocols, MAPI being one of those examples. I had mentioned before, Microsoft often leaves these protocols on to support legacy applications. So it's really up to the corporation or the company or the organization to actually understand if you can disable or turn off those protocols that pose a potential risk. And you've got to ask yourself, do you really, are you aware of what's actually running? Again, Microsoft leaves a lot of that on. And you've got to be able to ask yourself, do I have older legacy protocols running for potentially maybe backwards compatibility that are still actually required? All of these kind of challenges related to legacy apps and protocols make it difficult for full coverage for multi-factor, and it presents a challenge, and it presents an opportunity for cloud. Another common tactic for bypassing multi-factor is to trick users into basically installing malicious OAuth apps. And these are really powerful. Once installed, they will actually give the attacker access for 90 days without any kind of authentication challenge. So even if the password for an account is modified and changed, because they're in there and they've bypassed multi-factor, they're in there for 90 days by default. You may wonder who would be foolish enough to install one of these apps. And my response to you would be never underestimate the power of social engineering, right? But this idea of suspicious apps and being able to basically bypass multi-factor for 90 days, and this is, you know, this is with a valid token, even with users resetting, you know, credentials and passwords. And then finally, there's another example that I'll bring up here that, you know, this tactic was featured in a recent campaign, you know, against an Australian company, and it was widely attributed to China. And the social engineering trick was essentially to spoof an app for MailGuard 365, you know, which is a widely used security tool in the target organization. And users thought they were basically doing the right thing to improve their security by installing this app. Instead, they were essentially getting owned. But once installed, the attackers had persistent access and could essentially read user profiles as well as read and manipulate emails. Here's another one in terms of Microsoft Office 365, in terms of e-discovery, compliance, and search. And this is a powerful tool, and it can be leveraged for reconnaissance for an attacker. You know, attackers love living off the land in Office 365. And they're able to do this because they can leverage, you know, built-in tools to remain basically hidden, just as if, you know, they were doing this on-prem in a traditional network. And one example, again, is using Office 365 e-discovery, this compliance search tool, which basically enables a, you know, search capability for very targeted information across all of Office 365. So, for example, think about how powerful this is. If I wanted to potentially do a search for, you know, passwords, account numbers, or specific document types, I could do this, and I could do it across all of my, you know, OneDrive environment, or all across, you know, email, or all across SharePoint for an organization. It's extremely powerful, and it's all files, all, you know, OneNote notebooks, and a simple single command can facilitate that. So attackers love this. You know, e-discovery is used, you know, to facilitate this ability to basically, you know, stay hidden and live off the land for attackers. There is also something called Power Automate. And if you know anything about PowerShell, Power Automate is essentially an equivalent for Office 365. It's another great option for attackers being able to kind of live off the land. And it was originally, Power Automate was created to kind of automate day-to-day user tasks like, you know, managing email attachments or approval flows. And, you know, it enabled, the thing that's surprising, it's actually enabled by default in all Office 365 tenants. So it can do pretty amazing things, and it's there. There's no restriction on it. And it's not just for users. Attackers leverage this thing like crazy. And there's a few examples how I might, as an attacker, leverage this again, to kind of live off the land. But things like connecting over HTTP to a C2 to send data, I can automate that process, or automatically, syncing OneDrive files to, an attacker-owned Google Drive every time there's a modification to a specific file or files, or automating the tweet of all emails that include, let's say, a specific word. There's, I think, over 350 different application connectors available that relate to, leveraging Power Automate. And there's more being added every week. The options when it comes to this tool, in terms of Power Automate, pretty limitless. And the one kicker here is, Power Automate can also bypass your DLP, right? So as well as other security controls. So it can literally just bypass that. So these things are actively, these techniques, whether it's e-discovery, Power Automate, or some of the known things that make it challenging for multi-factor, so ways to get around that. These techniques are actively being used in the wild right now. Microsoft themselves recently published an example of an advanced attacker who used these to basically live off the land, these techniques. And he actually, this attacker maintained, complete Office 365 access for 213 days. And the way they did it, they used e-discovery to find data and Power Automate, which, you may recognize it as Flow, as once called Flow. They used Power Automate to basically exfiltrate, the information that they were finding with e-discovery. And it may be surprising, but Microsoft's security suite doesn't offer any kind of coverage for finding malicious use of the Power Automate. Nor does it give any kind of granular controls over which, the connectors can be used, or, governing, which users can actually access and use that. Literally, Power Automate, from a control perspective, is either on or off. That's about it. The response is from Microsoft is basically, the recommendation is enable multi-factor, but we've already talked about that. It's just not enough. So I was just going to mention this. It's interesting. I was on a call earlier this week, and I was listening to a security team talk a little bit about some of their challenges, and someone made a slight comment. They said, if somebody says one more thing about SolarWinds, it's going to give me indigestion. We use SolarWinds because it's extremely pertinent to this whole idea of these attacks that are happening with Office 365 or cloud, and essentially here it's just this is just the SEC filing when they came out initially, and basically SolarWinds uses Microsoft Office 365, and that was part of the challenge with the whole process with the SolarWinds Orion. So it's a very relevant topic, even though we've been hearing about it for quite some time. And really the question is, if you had a compromise, Office 365 account right now, how would you know? That this is part of the challenge. This is part of the problem with trying to get your hands around, having the kind of visibility that's required within Office 365 to be able to kind of manage it. So the trick is, I'm going to step back a little bit and talk about, how we use machine learning and, AI to kind of tackle this. And it requires a little bit of a kind of a foundational perspective on what we think about with when we talk about leveraging AI. And the trick is to kind of understand the correct way to apply machine learning and what problems you're trying to solve. whether the task is, comparable to like driving a nail or fastening a screw or detecting a hidden, HTTP tunnel. It really pays to have kind of the right tool for the right job. And the wrong tool can increase essentially the time to accomplish a task or even waste what I call valuable resources or worse. The reason I say that is leveraging, the power of machine learning or AI is really no different than having the right tool for the right job. And so I say that because Vectra has really tried to adopt this philosophy of implementing the most optimal kind of machine learning tool for each attack or behavior and detection algorithm. Each method has its own strengths. A lot of times companies will characterize themselves as AI companies, and essentially they're leveraging a single algorithm to basically address kind of every situation. We're very different in the sense that every single situation oftentimes is multiple models layered on each other to really understand what's happening. And the model best suited for example, finding something like a SQL injection against an internal database is not going to be the same model that's best suited for discerning something like an HTTP tunnel or an attacker moving laterally via a remote procedure call. And in looking at we talk about identifying behaviors, and we're using the automation of these machine learning models and AI to track behaviors. And the reason we're doing behaviors, and to kind of give you an idea, it's not that we are actually tracking every single type of behavior that an attacker might do. But when we kind of dissect an attack, first that's sort of done through our threat research, and our threat researchers really drive, a concept and try to characterize or distill, if you would, the essence of certain behaviors that are extremely unavoidable from an attacker's perspective. In other words, oftentimes it's techniques that we mentioned before that are proven. So it's very difficult for attackers to kind of leave something that's successful behind. They'll repurpose and reuse it. So when we kind of dissect these behaviors, they're typically things that attackers repeatedly do. They're part and parcel to basic techniques that they'll use to compromise. And so behaviors, if you will, especially if I can characterize that in an automated kind of AI model, they have what I call extreme durability. In other words, regardless of how something might dynamically change, the essence of that behavior can still be captured. One good example of that was initially when WannaCry dropped, we had some detections that specifically looked for worm-like behavior and the replication, as well as some of the obfuscation that was done with keys related to somebody covering their tracks or trying to hide export those keys that were used to encrypt something. We didn't really have a detection around ransomware specifically, but because we captured that worm-like behavior, that worm-like replication behavior, that was something that's been around for 10 plus years. And so we were able to capture that activity with WannaCry, even though we didn't have a detection, because we were looking at a behavior that was repurposed in the WannaCry ransomware variant with Eternal Blue, even without having a quote unquote very specific detection, more like a signature. And if you compare the behavioral models to things like signatures, I can flip a bit and basically, bypass a static signature. Signatures tend to be a little bit more on the transient side, whereas the reason we're focused on behaviors is they have a longevity and a durability. And that's actually what's really helped us to be able to capture some of these behaviors, even when we don't quite fully understand a new variation of them. We can still get the core behavior based on what we've kind of distilled into a detection. I want to talk just a little bit about MITRE. If you're familiar with at all with MITRE, MITRE is just a framework, and it is one way for me to kind of understand if I, have potential coverage gaps. And this is sort of our framework as it relates to MITRE's kind of mapping for Office 365. You can kind of see they look at this in terms of initial coverage, persistence, privilege escalation, defensive kind of evasion, credential access, discovery, et cetera. And you'll see where we've highlighted it. We have detections that cover those different behaviors. And then, where you see the white, we're a big believer in integration and playing well with, whoever might be in the security sandbox, if you will, in terms of developing, a full, process when it comes to any kind of, detection, response, and, kind of incident response workflow. And so MITRE presents us a way to kind of characterize, how well is my coverage? Where are my gaps today? Where are my holes? And so when we talk about mapping back to MITRE, really the drive in that is to have a framework which I can clearly understand and articulate, again, coverage and potential gaps. Another way to look at this is, in terms of specifically Office 365, we've got, Office 365 coverage, but also, AD coverage as well. So being able to detect malicious access to kind of any federated application. Here, in terms of pre-access, access, and persistence, as that relates to Active Directory, and the different types of detections that we're looking for. And then coupled with, full-on Office 365, where you're getting, deep into native Office 365 functionality with evasion, discovery, lateral, exfil type of behaviors, type of detections. And then this is just another way to look at MITRE. If you look at on the far left here, the vector detections in Office 365, these are, again, the type of behaviors we're looking for. So things like risky exchange operation, or a suspicious sign-on activity, or suspicious Azure AD operation, or an unusual e-discovery search, or a suspicious mail forwarding. And so what we do is the different T numbers are that is mapping back right to the MITRE attack framework. And then you can see on the far right, we're kind of explaining, what that behavior is like. So whether that's command and control, a lateral movement, internal reconnaissance, or some kind of exfiltration or of my data. And then this is, again, just a different way to look at this in terms of the different tactics that are being used, anything from access, persistence. This is really just a different view of the Lockheed Martin kill chain, or the attack life cycle. This is just a mapping really to what has to be accomplished within Office 365 in terms of the specific related, attack lifecycle for Microsoft Office 365. And then one of the things I was going to mention is we did a what we call a spotlight report, and this is we over the last 18 months we've done a tremendous amount of kind of developing capabilities around detecting attacker behaviors within Office 365. One of the first things we did initially was a lot of analytics. Those analytics really help us kind of zero in on behaviors that we want to develop you know AI models around. And so one of the first reports that we did, and this was across all the data sets that we had gathered over a good year or so. But you can kind of see here in this spotlight report, and this is available from Vectra, but it's the top 10 suspicious behaviors seen in Office 365. So if you just look at these detections, again, we see some of the likely culprits with things like suspicious power automate, a redundant access creation. You've got your SharePoint operation, obviously e-discovery, mail forwarding. And then if you look at the on the right-hand side, these are the types of different things that we're seeing related to Office 365 in terms of reconnaissance or exfil, command and control, and lateral. Lateral being kind of the most seen. And what is that saying? We mentioned, the Microsoft reference to being able to live off the land. The situation where they had found somebody that was basically sitting in Office 365 for over 200 days. And again, it's because laterally they were just sitting there, and they were using, again, the e-discovery to find something of interest. And then they were using the power automate to basically create a rule to exfil that data in an automated fashion. I have just two quick case studies here I wanted to kind of mention. And this is a mid-sized manufacturer. And it is a, they were finance users. The objective of this attack was really fraud related. Initially, it was legacy protocols. And then the action that really how we caught this is they were mail rules to basically steal info and basically evade any kind of detection. And that literally was a forward email related to DocuSign and some invoices. And then once that was forwarded, that the emails were deleted related to the passwords or security. And then once that occurred, the passwords were reset before any of the documents were forwarded. And in terms of detections, how we found that, initially it was a brute force. So there was multiple failed attempts followed by, a successful. And it was unusual from a particular IP, and that's how we found it in terms of for the account. There was also a detection for a suspicious sign-on. It was a proxied from a local geo. However, the user agent and authentication method were unusual, so those two things didn't add up. The risky exchange operation, there was some high-risk administrative mailbox actions that were, even though they were allowed, they were unusual, so they stood out. And then obviously suspicious mail forwarding. So the creation of an external forwarding rule was unusual for a particular account. So those are all, behaviors that obviously, if you're not paying attention, would seem normal within the course of Office 365. but when monitored and put with other things, the behaviors that stand out, and basically lend themselves to, an attacker being able to, be successful in terms of their objective. And then the second case study is a research university, and obviously, this was medical research, and the objective, from what we understood, was likely COVID related. The initial access was actually just a spear phishing to basically install a fake calendar optimization app. And then this was basically a lateral spread with the phishing email to trusted internal contacts. So again, once on the inside, very challenging. There's assumed trust, and so there's a lack of challenge. And then in terms of the outcome, again, the malicious OAuth app removed, and the phishing messages were deleted, and that was found through these particular detections. So initially, it was a suspicious app. There was an installation of that unique high permission app again, and then that was flagged, and then again, the other thing that was seen was an unusually high volume of that internal email sent in a short time, and so typical of kind of spraying once somebody's got access. So to kind of wrap up, what I wanted just to kind of leave you with in terms of being able to kind of keep your Office 365 deployment safe, um, you know, detect and stop the largest attack vector in Office 365. Again, 30% of organizations suffer account takeover, every single month. Understand attacker behavior and account privileges in your SaaS applications to stop breaches. It requires visibility in terms of really what's happening within that environment. The other piece I'll leave you with is attackers don't operate in silos. Your security shouldn't either. So tracking attacker activity, pivoting between on-premise, data center, infrastructure as a service, as well as SaaS is crucial. What we've seen in some of these latest public breaches has been the leveraging of Office 365 to really quickly pivot into other opportunities. We were actually even seeing it before kind of COVID, or actually mid-year last year, that there was compromises within Office 365, and then those were being leveraged while we were still going to the office. They were leveraged to then jump to an endpoint. So both from on-prem to cloud and from cloud to on-prem, those are realities in today's world. And then finally, Microsoft security telemetry can be overwhelming and feel a little bit disjointed when we talk to customers about how they're trying to address this, even with certain E5 licenses from Microsoft. The information is there, but it's very disjointed, and it's in multiple different solutions or aspect of their security stack as it relates to Microsoft. One of the things that we try to do is bring this all together, both from the perspective of on-prem, and we stitch that together with account information as it relates to the cloud, to give you kind of a holistic view of your environment. Again, keep your Office 365 deployment safe. Thank you very much for giving me an opportunity to speak with you today on cloud security.